Welcome to another episode of the Meat-N-Tater Show. I'm here with my co-host Meat.
Greetings and salutations, everybody.
I'm Tater, and we're excited to bring you this week's show. We're going to make our way through some meaty facts and some buttery opinions, and this week's topic is the death of Kurt Cobain.
All right, let's jump into it. Talking about Kurt Cobain, was it a suicide or was it something more sinister, like murder?
Murder.
What's your stance, Tater?
Tater is anticipating and anxious for the first major disagreement on the Meat-N-Tater Show. We've been in the same conspiracy sleeping bag this whole time, so now we're going to have to I'm going to sleep on the non-conspiracy couch tonight between us two, but I'm going to say that the official story is the real story in this case, so I'm taking the stance that Kurt Cobain took his own life.
So you are pro Kurt Cobain suicide, and I'm going to jump on the side of there's something else going on, and at the very least that the story should be turned into undetermined, but I think Courtney Love is an evil woman, similar to Carol Baskins.
I am so glad you said that, because I was thinking, as I was getting a lot of information on this, I was like, Carol Baskins existed before we knew about her, and she has a sister named Courtney Love, because no matter where you fall on the suicide or murder part of this argument, like, Courtney Love's a bitch. Like, she is not somebody that did very good things with the life of Kurt Cobain.
I think they probably like shared notes or something. Carol called up Courtney. He's like, hey, how did you do like this, and this thing? Kind of, yeah. Evil people. So are there any points from the case that you feel like solidify the verdict of suicide by Kurt Cobain?
I would say that the official story being the official story. I mean, he's a celebrity, so having an official story around his death is, I just can't imagine where there would be a lot of influence from Courtney Love to get into the coroner's pockets or whatever to convince them to do something covert, police officers, so on and so forth. Like, I mean, I can understand maybe wanting to have your guy killed because he was trying to take you off of the will, but going steps higher than that to influence the official story, I think that's a lot more difficult. And so that, combined with the fact that they reopened it around the 20-year anniversary of his death to investigate again, and then to again come to the same conclusion that it was in fact a suicide, that official story seems really, really solid, especially because, I mean, you have a lot of people clamoring for his death to not be suicide, because he spoke for so many people who struggled through mental illness or broken homes, and then he, in a sense, and this is not my opinion by any means, but in a sense gave up on that struggle to speak out in those regards. So I think people really, really wanted to have a conspiracy theory to make it easier and more tangible, more attainable to just like understand that, okay, this guy's gone.
Yeah, kind of in that similar vein there was a bunch of copycat suicides immediately after, I don't want to say immediately, but over the years following Kurt Cobain's death. And so if the fact that he hadn't, actually killed himself, people would start to think, well, these people killed themselves because they saw it as some kind of, I don't really understand the argument. They see it as like a glorification or something like that, but they did it because he did it. And to say that he didn't kill himself will kind of like shed some negative light on these other people that did kill themselves to be like Kurt Cobain. So I think that kind of goes along with what you were saying there. You did bring up something about you said, did you say divorce? Is that what you said?
I didn't mention their divorce, but I did mention that he was trying to get her off of his will.
Off the will, that's right.
Yeah, off of his will.
So we'll start there then. Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain had a prenuptial agreement that in the event that they did get divorced, it starts out in a way that Courtney Love was more famous at the beginning of their relationship. So she was making more money. In that instance, the prenuptial agreement benefits her. But then as the Nirvana, their band stardom kind of takes off, Kurt Cobain starts to make more money. And so then at that point, the prenuptial agreement would actually be harmful to Courtney Love financially. So a lot of people are saying that that is a motive, that if in the events that if they did get divorced, she would be financially ruined. Whereas if Kurt Cobain, if something else were to happen, that she would recover from that a little bit better financially. So some people are saying that, that's motive.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being motive, because I mean we're talking about two drug addicts who don't have the strongest of mental states, who are also very rich and famous. So I mean, if you know anything about drug addicts, like you go the opposite end of the spectrum, people who are homeless with the same situation, they don't have, prenuptial agreements with millions of dollars on the line, but they will go to any length to protect the little property that they have. So you just take that and multiply it by a lot, and you give people power and sway and those kinds of things. So I could definitely see that Courtney Love has a motive, but that's not enough to convince me that she did it, because there's a lot to go through for her to pull the trigger on that, and no pun intended, to to I mean, that's the father of her child, and there are a lot of things roped up in that. And to kind of expand off of Courtney's Courtney Love's narcissism. I don't want to say Courtney because I don't know her on a first name basis, but Courtney Love's narcissism. Like, there was a point in time when they were kind of both doing record deals, and she wanted to make a record deal with the same company, and basically said that whatever Nirvana and Kurt Cobain were going to get, she wanted to make more than that. And so she's definitely, I mean, when we say that she's not a nice person, we really mean that, because she was just full of herself and, very, very strong-minded in that regard. But here's the thing. Maybe she was going to be taken out of the will, and maybe she was going to have some financial fallout, but it's not like she's poor. It's not like you want Kurt Cobain to be alive to continue to reap the benefits, like long term, the benefits of the relationship with him and his fame and success. Like, why does she want him to die just because he's trying to get her off the will? Like, there's other things that could be done, like legally, to make sure that she's protected and receives financial compensation in connection to their relationship.
I think part of what you're going into now is the logical mind of a heroin addict. And I think that those two are probably, I don't want to say mutually exclusive, but highly inversely correlated. They probably don't coexist together in the same brain matter. So I don't think that Courtney Love is here thinking very forward thinking here. But, as I say that, I also understand that the way that she's been painted in this conspiracy theory is that it was some epic plot. The suicide attempt that actually did Kurt Cobain was one of several suicide attempts. And she I don't want to say plotted, it kind of like retroactively went back and painted all of his previous overdoses and things like that as suicide attempts. But when they were happening, nobody was actually seeing them as suicide attempts. So maybe she's a little bit more forward thinking than I thought. Maybe she just thought this was an easier way to get it done. It was the 90s, baby.
Right. Yeah. And one of the most famous suicide attempts that, the conspiracy theory side of it will say that supports her involvement in his death is the one in Rome. So the one in Rome comes up a lot, because the prescription that he had in the medicine that he had in his system was a prescription that was under her name. She was the only one with him. I mean, there's a lot of things going on there that definitely smells of foul play.
I thought you were pro
No, I'm
suicide.
just being objective. I am being objective and recognizing that there's some muddy water that we're in. I think that of all the conspiracy theories that I kind of stand against, this one has some murky water to it. But I mean, I don't know how she can be so unsuccessful with all of these other attempts to overdose him, but then somehow get him on his knees to then get him to shoot himself with a shotgun, or someone sets him up to shoot himself with a shotgun. I don't know how that seems more complex. Like, it's easy to get a drug addict to take drugs and to potentially overdose. So that seems a lot simpler. So how is the more complex thing going to be the method that works? That one it kind of loses its strength to me when you think about the more complex the plan, how in the world does that work versus the easier to do stuff. And to refute, I guess, the fact that I brought up Rome, like, why did she called the ambulance? Like, she called medical professionals to come intervene. So if she wants him to die, to leave the will in the state that it was in, since he didn't get a chance to sign it, then why call someone in to save his life?
She's trying to paint that picture of several attempts that aren't successful before he finally has that successful attempt, so that she gets off a little more scot-free, a little less scrutiny thrown in her direction. I'm glad you brought up the amount of drugs that were in his system, though. But were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say that if that's the case, if she was that methodical in these drug overdoses, to ride that roller coaster, to bring him about to him shooting himself, that is truly diabolical.
Sinister,
Yeah.
yeah. So, talking about the amount of drugs that were in his system, some reports say that what's going on in there?
Sorry.
Little dancing,
Just,
picking wedgies.
yeah, no, had to adjust a little bit there. Sorry.
Gotcha. All right. So I'm glad you brought up the amount of drugs that were in his system, because at the time of his death, some reports say that there was triple the maximum lethal dose of what would be required to kill a severe addict. So a severe addict is somebody that has considerable tolerance, so they would need more anyways. And then there is triple that maximum lethal dose. So somebody that has that much heroin in it. So when heroin goes into your bloodstream, what happens is it gets turned into morphine. And that's why people feel so good whenever they take heroin. So people on morphine, though, they're basically vegetables. And then if you take that much, like, you're useless. So how did somebody with that much heroin in their system get up and put a shotgun in their mouth and pull the trigger? And some people are saying that's not physically possible.
Okay, so this one to me, because when you're talking about a general idea of addiction and tolerance and those kinds of things, there are so many outliers in what tolerance is. And I worked in a pharmacy for a little over a year as a clerk, and there would be people that would come in, like, just these feeble looking people that didn't seem like they had any problems or anything going on. And they would get a very strong prescription. And this is all according to the pharmacist. They did have a very strong prescription drug that they were getting filled for the month. And they'd come back 3 days later for trying to get more. I mean, 30 pills gone in 3 days. So when it comes to tolerance, when it comes to, like, what can be in a person's system, I think it's an individualistic case to me. That, I mean, he was a hard drug user for a long time, and it's so hard to pinpoint a generalized data point and then put that on one person and say, oh, because of the generalized data point, that means it had to be that way for Kurt Cobain. Like some people just can, I mean, just think about how people handle alcohol. If I have like 2 beers, like, I can get a little loopy in my head, like, because I cannot handle alcohol. I just can't. Like, so, but someone who has a higher tolerance to it, or they're just genetically wired to handle that stuff better. I just don't see this as something being anything more than just his ability to tolerate a lot of hard drugs that he's used, over a very long period of time. He's a chronic abuser, a severe abuser. And I mean, yeah, he's tons of overdoses. I mean, push the limits over and over again, and you're going to eventually, build that tolerance up, even if it's at extreme level.
So you cross paths with a lot of drug dealers. It sounds like people selling out 30-day prescriptions in 3 days. That's all that sounds like to me.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Bunch
just some
of
pretty
old
old
people.
ladies. Yeah. I mean, it
Yeah.
could be. It could
I
be.
mean, they got to supplement that Social Security income somehow, man.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Got to buy all the presents around Christmas. They're not just doing that off Social Security.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah, but the points that were being made were that they have, like, levels that they expect severe addicts to have. And then somebody that's a severe addict, if they had triple the lethal dose, then, like, maybe 1 or 2 times the amount would be, suicide maybe, but triple is kind of like a let's make sure this gets done kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then the cause of death for Kurt Cobain is the gunshot wound to the head, allegedly, because I know that the autopsy was never released to the public.
Mm.
So nobody really knows for sure, but I know that some people have said that they know that the outcome was ruled a suicide, but how does somebody with 3 times a lethal dose of heroin in their system kill themselves with a shotgun? They shouldn't even be able to move, let alone pick up a gun and put it in their mouth and still have the coordination to pull the trigger and also like load the gun and all of
Right.
that stuff. So that's
Right.
the big question there.
And another counterpoint to that is that not only is there like could there be outlying like high levels of tolerance, but also these kinds of drugs build up in your system over time. So someone who is a drug abuser, it would not be unreasonable for them to use
Yeah.
drugs over a long period of time, and that would show up as a, if you kind of say, okay, if this were all taken at one time, could it be your lethal dose, and we expect even a severe user to die from this much drug usage? Then yeah, that would make sense if we're only arguing the fact of did it all get taken at once. But I mean, if I mean, again, he is an obvious addict. Nobody's refuting that. But he's probably using multiple days. I mean, they're just. I listen to a lot of comedy, and a lot of the comedians I listen to, they talk about their drug use either in the past or currently. I mean, if Timothy Leary, I don't know if you know who that is, but he was kind of like the guy that founded psychedelics and kind of got that rolling. So anybody uses psychedelics out there, you can probably thank Timothy Leary for that. But he used hard drugs like every day for years. People that followed him used hard drugs every day for not just psychedelics, but all kinds of stuff. So this would, you take a blood test from those guys, it would show up. Their levels would be really high. Like they would not exactly, it wouldn't show like their daily dose. It would show a ton more than that. And I think you have to take that into consideration as well. Now, the autopsy not being released, I don't know much about that honestly, but I definitely would think that the findings of his lethal levels of drugs in his system could be traced back to his chronic use of drugs.
We'll just agree to disagree on that point.
Okay.
So let's see, what's my next point here? So where he was found, uh, they found the gun next to him, and when they checked it for prints, there were no discernible prints on the gun. So if Kurt Cobain were to have shot himself, there'd at least be some fingerprints, some of his own fingerprints on the gun, but there were no fingerprints on the gun. How do you explain that?
Fingerprints. I think I want to bring up a story that you and I both experienced to kind of talk about this.
Oh boy.
Fingerprints are really tough because you have, I can't think of the technical term off the top of my head, but you have like the most obvious forms of fingerprints, which are ones that you can visibly see, like a smudge on glass or those kinds of things. And you also have latent fingerprints. So I think the all of the fingerprints that they could pull from the gun and from the shell were all latent fingerprints. Like they weren't obvious, they weren't something that they could easily pull. And so this is a very common thing. Like fingerprints are not, like we can see it from TV shows and from movies, but fingerprints are not the most reliable form of identifying who's been there and who hasn't been there. So if you remember when you and I were roommates, we had someone break into the house
Mm-hmm.
and we called the police. They came out and they weren't going to do a whole lot. And I asked them, like, are you at least going to check for fingerprints? And that was pretty much their response. Like, look, this is not reliable. Even if you are able to get fingerprints, you have so many factors that are going to make it difficult for us to find somebody that potentially broke into your house and stole your stuff. And because it leads to, not only are you going to have a hard time getting a full fingerprint from something, um, you're also going to have like multiple fingerprints on a particular item. So you have, you know, if you're talking about the gun, you've had people who have handled the gun before the person who bought the gun, because Kurt Cobain did not buy that gun for himself. It was purchased for him. So you're going to have fingerprints from other people on there, from it being handled, moved around. So getting a clear fingerprint is just going to be tough anyway. And then, I mean, and then it's not uncommon to have problems with fingerprinting.
But so previous gun owners may or may not have cleaned the guns, and then if it's being put somewhere to be showcased, like they'll probably get cleaned. And then if somebody buys it for him, that person's fingerprints could be on there, or at some point they should have been, maybe not should have been, but I feel like it's probably highly likely that they could have pulled his fingerprints from the gun. If not from the gun, then at least the shells that he loaded into the gun. And the facts of the case are that they couldn't pull any discernible fingerprints from the gun, from the shells, or anywhere near. It says near the gun. I don't know why that's
Like doorknobs,
important.
chairs, like
I guess maybe,
windows.
yeah, that's what they're referring to there. So that's kind of the point there, is that if he had loaded the gun to kill himself somewhere in there, he would have to press hard enough to leave what they're calling a discernible fingerprint, but they couldn't
Mm-hmm.
find anything like that. So I don't know, maybe somebody with gloves on, after they loaded him up with a bunch of morphine and heroin, they put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger for him and then wiped the gun down, like in all those TV shows.
Yeah, I don't have a way. I mean, this is kind of, I don't have a way to refute like there needing, quote unquote, needing to be a solid fingerprint there. Again, I don't know how fingerprinting works 100%, but when you have like the people who use that as a resource commonly say, look, this is not reliable, and it turns out to not be reliable in this case, like that seems fairly solid. I mean, if they not being able to pull any fingerprints from a room, yeah, I mean, it's fishy. I'm not, again, we're in muddy waters. We're in muddy waters for sure, but it's not something that I'm willing to rule out suicide just because you couldn't nail something down in a very unreliable area anyway.
It was the gun, the shells, and then his suicide note. The note that he wrote, the note that he wrote. His suicide note had no discernible fingerprints on it, which is,
Hey, maybe he washed his hands a lot, didn't have any oil on his hands,
he was worried about coronavirus
very,
26 years.
that's right. That's
It's
right. Yeah.
good
He's like,
call.
like you never
Just
know. I might have
getting,
it and I could pass it along. Maybe that's where it
getting
started.
lots of practice in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So moving on to the note that he left, like the last four. So it's a huge note. I'm not super familiar with suicide notes. I do know that a lot of people use it to kind of say things that they wanted to say for a long time and that they didn't have a chance to. So, but I'm not really sure what the length on average is of them. But this note is particularly long. It's an entire piece of paper, just like in the tiniest little handwriting. And then at the bottom, like the last 4 or 5 lines, the handwriting is extremely different. It has to be another person. Like, there's no way that it's his handwriting. And something that's kind of suspicious that goes with that is they found in one of Courtney Love's backpacks where it appeared that she was practicing mimicking somebody else's handwriting. So,
Interesting. Very
connecting
interesting.
those two dots, could Courtney Love have been practicing to kind of put the final dot there on a suicide note that was left next to Kurt Cobain's body?
I think, I mean, as far as that goes, I mean, Courtney Love it's going to be proven over and over again that she had some bad intentions with the life of Kurt Cobain. It could be just as likely that maybe she was just trying to set him up to show incompetence, like if he's going to take her name off the will and legally change something that like he wasn't in a proper mental state to be able to make changes to this legal document that's already existing. So I mean, I think it could be just as likely that she's trying to basically ruin his character and ruin his state of mind to preserve an already like notarized and legal document. But now to go back to the handwriting portion of the suicide note, and I want to connect it back to basically the amount of drugs that was found in his system. So I want to make 2 points here. One is that if he did put a crazy amount of drugs in his system, the events of what happened with him taking the drugs and writing the note and killing himself all could happen within a matter of minutes, not hours, not days. So if he I'll put together a timeline that I think is most likely here. It's that he is in a very bad state mentally. he's struggling with his thoughts of suicide and wanting to take his own life, and he's struggling with all of the things that are happening in his life. So basically, to get his nerve up, he ingests a lot of drugs. He starts to write his note. As the drugs kick in, his handwriting would begin to change. Like it's a pretty easy logical step there to say, okay, if he is at the beginning of his state of being high, he's writing a note how he normally would, and as he gets higher and less in touch with his faculties, he's losing control of his handwriting. And so to me, that one's, again, that doesn't, I can see there being a connection to Courtney Love potentially copying his handwriting, but I say, I mean, he's a drug user writing his note, probably getting his quote unquote confidence up to do what he feels like he has to do in the moment. So he's getting himself there, and as he's getting there to finally take his own life, it shows up in his lack of control over his handwriting.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. The only problem is that on the note, it doesn't happen gradually. The change is all at the end, and it's very sudden, and it it doesn't really. With heroin, you kind of or with morphine, the effective part of the heroin in the human body, it's a downer, so it'll make you lose control of stuff instead of like a psychedelic where things just kind of change. And so as you're losing faculties, your handwriting should deteriorate, but the handwriting just gets bigger and it's actually neater. So it's kind of the opposite of what you would expect for somebody that was on something like morphine. We'll leave something in the show notes for everybody to look at what I'm talking about. So yeah, I that would be a fair assessment, but I don't think that the note, to me personally, in my expertise as a handwriting assessor, or I don't even know what you call those people, but it doesn't look like that's what's happening to me. It just looks like somebody, the handwriting is so different. It has to be another person. And even like how he's talking before in the first 2/3 of the art, even maybe even a little bit more, how he's in his note, he just sounds so different than the way he sounds at the end. Maybe that talks more to the drugs kicking in that you were talking about, but I don't know. It seems very, very different the last 4 or 5 lines there to me.
Well, and I mean, this happens in conversations like when you're coming to a conclusion that you don't really want to come to. Maybe the way you think and the way you process changes as well. I mean, I'm not sure how familiar you are with having to make hard decisions in life, but sometimes when you have to make hard decisions, like you have a stance, you have a viewpoint, and as things wind down, you can kind of maybe change the way you feel about something or the way you communicate about something. And I'll be honest, I haven't looked at this note in particular to know the content, so what I'm saying could be totally off, but I know just how when you're in a sober state of mind dealing with a difficult decision, especially from a poor mental health state, that the internal arguments can be circular. The points you're trying to make could be missed. Kurt Cobain was not in a mentally healthy state. I mean, he basically, since his parents divorced when he was a teenager, friends and family basically said he wasn't the same. Like, he was your easygoing guy, and he was, loved everybody and got along with everybody. And then it completely changed his life. Not only when his parents got divorced, but when his father remarried. Like, it just really shifted for him. Everything shifted for him. So you're at a point where you're about to take your own life. I can't imagine that you're going to write a doctrinal thesis type of suicide note that's going to make a whole lot of sense. Like, I mean, you're at deep mental anguish. And yeah, so I have a lot of leeway there for the writing style. Or now, as far as it getting neater, that's really interesting. If there were hearts over the eyes, or there were like smiley faces in the sentence, I'm like, okay, then you might pull me all the way to the other side if we've got like some very feminine handwriting jumping in here. But
I think you just have to look at it. I put it in the chat there for you to take a look.
this looks like my handwriting.
You see at the bottom what I'm talking about there? Just those last like 4 or 5 lines, everything gets bigger.
Yeah.
And then if you go back and read it, I mean, if you really want to, you can sit back and read it all, but frame of mind just changes immensely.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I'm doing. I am trying to be really objective at looking at this here because I have not seen this before. I don't really think there's that much different in the handwriting style. The A's are similar. I mean, I guess I could see. I'm trying to find like similar letters.
Yeah, but the A's will be similar because Courtney was practicing.
Let me see. I mean, that's true. I mean, if she's practicing and she's doing a really good job of it, then maybe she's nailed these down. But yeah, I'm actually having a hard time reading it just because of his penmanship. So I don't really want to maybe take the time to read that right now.
Yeah, see his horrible penmanship at the beginning, and then all of a sudden at the bottom, it's super big, super readable.
It's just because it's big. It's just because it's
Yeah,
big.
that's what I'm saying. He wasn't writing like that for all that time there, and then all of a sudden he just decides, I want everybody to easily be able to read these last 5 lines.
Yeah. Well, hey, look, I got in trouble in elementary school for pushing a kid down in the playground, and I had to write 250 sentences of "I will not push someone down in the playground." And so I wrote like the first 15 sentences, like normally, like I will not, word by word, line by line. And then I realized anytime there's an L, I can just draw a line straight down the page. And then that's my L for the whole page for that word. So, sometimes when you're desperate, you do what you got to do. So if the letters got to get bigger, then they got to get bigger.
Did you push any more kids down on the playground? Did it work?
No, I did push kids in the future, but that kid deserved it. I was reacting to being pushed in the first
It's
place, and I got in trouble.
probably, you found a way to get around having to write all those L's. And so because you found that loophole, that lesson was lost on you.
That's right. That's right. That's
And
exactly
just
right.
kept going on pushing kids over.
That's right.
Nicely
Shoot, if I have to
done.
write more sentences, I got my L's down for days.
Saves me time. I can go push more kids around.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think that's all of the points that I had leading up to Kurt Cobain's death being questionable at best. After he died, the guy that performed the autopsy was Dr. Nicholas. I don't ever know how to say this. In Oklahoma, there's a town called Hartshorn, but then there's people that say Hartshorn. I don't ever know how to say this guy's name. I'm going to call him Hartshorn just because that's how I'm used to saying it. So Dr. Nicholas Hartshorn. He was a doctor that was personally known to Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love. Whenever he began his investigation, he began it with the claim that the death was ruled a suicide. And I think in most cases, they begin with the ruling that it's a homicide. So that was kind of suspicious that he started with the conclusion of a suicide before he investigated it. And then later, this was a while later, but after the case had already been closed, he died in an accident, a base jumping accident, kind of like Epstein went base jumping off of his cell in
Yeah, he's going for that 10-foot elevation base
yeah,
jump.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, people that are tied to high profile deaths just mysteriously dying in random accidents. I don't know. Something's always suspicious to me there.
Yeah, I understand protocols for how things normally get ruled in like the coroner's field of work, but I also could understand if they're like, okay, we walked in, shotgun between his legs, he's laid on the ground, single gunshot wound to the head, apparent suicide. I could see that being something that probably could have made a mistake. Could have made a mistake and just, not a mistake was like, oh, he wrote down the wrong words. Like, okay, I'm just going to go with I'm going to go with the police report and write down that it's a suicide. So,
well, they probably only had one gunshot wound because if he had been double tapped, yeah, there would have been a big red flag there.
You know what? You're right. You're right. Yeah. That wasn't my main point, but you're right. If there's multiple gunshot wounds, like, dang it, I didn't get it the first time.
I miss. Yeah. So yeah, those are probably my biggest points. Some people are talking about there was a guy that admitted to doing it, but it was kind of fishy on how the story was corroborated. But basically, somebody admitted to killing him.
Yeah, he said that Courtney Love tried to pay him $50,000. Is that the same guy?
Yeah, Eldon Hoke, and then I can't remember the guy's name who actually Let's see here if I can find it. I don't know. Somebody admitted to doing it, and it was at the behest of Courtney Love going through another person. So she tried to remove herself several degrees from actually having to actually go through with it. So she hired like a hitman who hired a hitman. Very Carol Baskins, right?
That's very, very Carol Baskin-esque.
Yeah.
So are we just stuck in a weird time loop here where from another dimension, Carol Baskin and her husband were just Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain?
Yeah, every
And
20
instead of
years or
being
so, if you don't know your history, it's doomed to repeat itself, right?
right, right. So
So,
instead of, being musicians, they were, animal rescue types.
rescue. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, I think that one of the so it's hard enough for totally competent people to keep a secret and to keep things under wraps. I mean, you look at movie producers and directors and developers. You go into basically the entertainment world where there's a build towards a culmination of a lot of work, and then things start to get leaked about, oh, this sneak peek of this thing, or oh, there's going to be this feature on this particular piece of technology, and things get leaked. Like, this is when people are trying to keep things secret for a reason, by people who are totally in their right minds, totally not addicted to, well, they may be addicted to drugs, but it's not not as obvious, and things get out. I have a really hard time thinking that I mean, this is a pretty elaborate thing to potentially have pulled off, and to be under the influence of some pretty hard drugs with other people who may not be as maybe as intelligent or as savvy as Courtney Love. I just have a hard time
what
thinking that they could have pulled this off.
which part is elaborate?
I mean, just kind of alluding to what you said about her setting him up with the quote unquote overdoses. Like, he's not really overdosing. She's just laying the tracks for,
Hmm.
she's setting the scene for a longer version of the story. So
I don't know. At the very least, it could be, a good story, make a good movie. They say there's always a tint of truth to all the good stories, right?
that's right. But
Yeah.
as someone who has a family history of mental health struggles and has had those in the past myself, that this may be one of the reasons why I don't want to lean too far away from the official story, is because I don't think this has happened, but to downplay the severe place he was with his mental health, I think is kind of an insult, I guess, to the struggle Kurt Cobain had in his life. And not that it's a justification for anything. I just have a hard time. I have a hard time seeing someone who had that much trauma and that much difficulty and struggle. I mean, because it wasn't just the fact that his parents divorced. It wasn't the fact that his father got remarried. It was, I mean, he had a hard time leaving his friends. Like, he was just a normal guy that fell into a really lucky spot in the world, and leaving behind his old friends, getting into drug addiction, finding out that people had raped a girl to one of his songs, and it kind of, like, that weight of that, like, feeling that responsibility for causing that. In his mind, he thought it was something that he caused. So then you throw into the fact that you're trying to now raise a child in this world. You have your child's mother is making life difficult for you, the stress of success and what that brings, again, the drug addiction. So you compound all of that together. I mean, obviously the conspiracy theory side would say, well, this is a perfect environment to take advantage of killing this guy to get what we want. But it's also like, I mean, it's not unreasonable by any means that he would take his life.
It's not unreasonable. I agree. But I think that this the last point that we were talking about a minute ago. The guy's name is Eldon Hoke or Hoke. I
I
don't
think
know
it's
how to
Hoke.
Hoke. Okay.
Yeah.
So he was known by moniker El Duce, so the Duke. And Courtney Love was recorded as having asked him for a favor. And she says, "My old man's a real asshole. I need you to blow his king head off." So there's that. And then Hoke took a lie detector test, which obviously they have their own issues, but the test was administered by a renowned expert, Dr. Edward Gelb, who says there is no doubt that Hoke was telling the truth. So if Eldon Hoke was telling the truth, that Courtney put him up to it, and then Eldon Hoke was later run over by a train, which is a really interesting way to go. But,
Do you
you
not
know,
see or hear that coming?
he's one of those people that he's a loose end that gets tied up mysteriously. Yeah, run over by a train. But he was on record as having said that his friend Alan was the one that fulfilled the contract for having killed Kurt Cobain. And so Eldon Hoke has a contact, a fellow musician named Alan Wrench, who is the person that possibly could have been spoken of whenever he said Alan fulfilled the contract. And I think what they're alluding to here is Alan Wrench is possibly the one that killed Eldon Hoke by like tying him up on a train track or something. But they said that Alan was the last person to see Hoke alive. So
Yeah, the that is the most, as far as the conspiracy side goes, that is the most likely story. But I mean, there's a reason why lie detector tests are usually not permissible in court cases. It's because of just their unreliability. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, if he's telling the truth, then that's insane that they were able to pull this off and they were able to tie up their loose ends and life went on for everybody else. But it's not it's not proven. Like it's not enough. There's no proof. Nobody proved it. Muddies the
I
water the
mean,
most.
you're right. There's got to be beyond a shadow of a doubt. But I don't know. We've got motive. We've got the weapon. We've got people capable of doing it. Just enough muddy facts that, man, Dane, I don't know if it was a suicide. I don't think it was a suicide.
We'll have to close this one out on agreeing to disagree. Unfortunately, I think Kurt Cobain succumbed to the mental health pressures that he was facing.
All right. Well, that's our show. If you guys liked it, subscribe, hit that button down there, check out our show notes, and rate us, review us.
And also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Meat-N-Tater Show. There's not a lot of content there, but follow us anyway. So I don't think we have any followers yet, but but if we do get a follower, we will absolutely be happy to cater to that base. So, but until next time, keep those tinfoil hats nice and shiny.
And this is me saying, don't let the lizard people bite.